Hey everyone, and welcome to Season 2, Episode 4 of Providential America. As always, thank you for listening, liking, subscribing, following, giving reviews, and all the things associated with keeping up with the podcast. If you haven't already, make sure to turn on notifications so you'll know when each new episode drops. And now, let's dive in. Did President Abraham Lincoln ever mention Divine Providence in relation to the Civil War? Did he believe that God had played any role whatsoever in the bloody conflict which had taken place in the United States between 1861 and 1865? Well, in today's episode, we'll see how one of Abraham Lincoln's most famous speeches, which took place in the final days of the Civil War, was more akin to a sermon than a political address. We'll observe how his conclusions related to the work of divine providence, and we'll discuss how he believed God had worked through the war to bring about his holy purposes. This is the story of Lincoln's sermon. The 16th President of the United States stepped forward and looked out upon the crowd. Tens of thousands of people stood before him. The chilly March wind blew across his worn face as he looked out upon the masses. He looked out into their faces. What a collection of Americans had braved the muddy streets and dreary weather to hear him speak on this day. Before him stood fathers, mothers, sons and daughters, widows and orphans, Union soldiers, both black and white, many of whom bore the scars of the battles they had endured. Many of these had even lost limbs in service to their country. Yet here they were, hoping to hear the words of their victorious president. Their faces, too, were worn and tired. Yet there was also something in many of their countenances that he had not seen nearly enough of these past 4 years. A look of hope, even a degree of anxious excitement. He closed his eyes for a moment, but it seemed to him to be much longer as memories of the past 4 years came flooding back to his mind. Just 4 years ago, he had stood and delivered a speech before a different sort of crowd. There had been a gnawing nervousness, tension, and fear which had gripped the hearts of his hearers. And yet none present at the time, including himself, could have anticipated how difficult the years of 1861 to early 1865 would be. 4 years ago, they had been on the precipice of a civil war. The country had rent as the states of the Deep South had claimed to have seceded and formed a separate nation. His goal had been to preserve the Union at all costs. In those days, he had been Abraham Lincoln, the lawyer. He had made his arguments for why the states could neither legally nor constitutionally secede, and so much of what he had to say had fallen on deaf ears at the time. He had argued fervently for the Union to remain together, for the southern states to come back into harmony with their northern neighbors, and for arms to be set aside. Yes, he had been Lincoln the lawyer in those days, but oh, how things had changed. How he had changed. He hadn't wanted this war. He didn't believe that anyone truly had. Yet the war came. It came with a swiftness and a level of depravity that had taken the nation's breath away and driven the populace to the brink. At his command, men had gone off to war. Wives had lost husbands, children had lost fathers, mothers had lost sons, and cities had been sacked. No one in this nation that he loved and that he led had been immune to the grief which had gripped it these past 4 years. His own household was no exception to this. He glanced toward his aide, who was holding Lincoln's favorite stovepipe hat. He looked at the black silk mourning band that adorned it for the past 3 years. His brow furrowed as the familiar pain and melancholy clawed at his heart. Death had found his home early in the war. The walls of the White House could not hold out the cold grip of death, it had turned out. His precious 11-year-old son, Willie, who was perhaps the most reflective and thoughtful of his children, had become ill along with his younger and also precious son, Tad. Bilious fever they had called it, an illness that is now known as typhoid fever. Tad eventually recovered, but Willie had not been so fortunate. His son, his dear Willie, who had often remarked that he wanted to become a minister of the gospel one day, passed from this life in February of 1862. It had been all he could do to hold himself together, and there had been nothing he could do to bring relief to his wife, Mary, whose grief was so incredibly heavy. On many a day and night, her loud cries and grief-stricken wailing could be heard throughout the White House. Death had seemingly been on every side of him. He had neared the breaking point on numerous occasions, and it was only because of the grace of Providence, he knew, that he had not descended into madness. Meanwhile, the war had begun as a disaster for the Union, especially here in the East. Battle after battle was lost by his inept commanders of the Army of the Potomac in the first year of the conflict. He had increasingly turned to prayer in those days, begging the Almighty for a victory. Then came Antietam, the bloodiest single day of the entire war. Yet it was a much-needed Union victory, even if it came at an enormous cost. From there followed the Emancipation Proclamation, the subject of a future episode of Providential America, by the way. Gettysburg, Vicksburg, and the turning of the tide throughout 1863. Generals Grant and Sherman, in particular, had proven to be able generals for Lincoln, and they had achieved much success over the past year. Sherman had completed his march to the sea in Georgia and was sweeping northward through the Carolinas. Grant was coming ever closer to cornering General Robert E. Lee and his quickly depleting forces as Union forces advanced toward Richmond. It had become plain to every serious observer of the war that the conflict was finally drawing to a close. It was only a matter of time now before the Confederate forces would have to admit ultimate defeat. The recent Union successes in the war had resulted in Abraham Lincoln winning in a landslide in the recent election of 1864, although there was a time that he had assumed his loss to Democratic candidate George McClellan was most assured. Providence had seen fit to allow him to stand here on the east portico of the U.S. Capitol yet again in order to deliver an inaugural address to the nation. His speech, this time around, was quite a bit shorter compared to his first inaugural address. When crafting the words for this speech, he had given much thought to what needed to be said. He could boast about the recent Union successes on the battlefield. He could declare that it was time to punish those of the Confederacy as the Union was made whole again. He could deride those who had doubted him these past 4 years and who had stood in the way of achieving the triumph in this conflict. But none of that is what he chose to do. It all would have been too brazen, too callous, even too blasphemous in his mind. No, what this nation needed now was not arrogance, or vengeance, or more hatred. What this nation needed was healing, reconciliation, and humble reflection, and a return to a full reliance upon divine providence. As he had contemplated what needed to be said, his thoughts had gone time and again to the plight of the enslaved throughout the nation. The Emancipation Proclamation had been a step in the right direction, but it ultimately had taken the passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution to bring about the complete end of the institution of slavery in America. This had not been his intention at the start of this awful war, and yet the war had made possible the ending of this dreadful institution of human bondage. People pointed to him as the reason slavery had ended. They tried to give him credit for the newfound freedom of so many in this nation. But he knew who was ultimately responsible for this emancipation, and he wanted his fellow countrymen to realize who was due the praise for this as well. He had solemnly meditated on the words of Scripture as he penned the words which he would deliver to the nation. This war, the end of slavery, and the outworkings of history itself were, it was clear to him now, due to the sovereign work of divine providence. He had no doubt in his mind that all was done according to the Lord's perfect will and sovereign decree. All that had happened and all that would happen was the result of God's work. Lincoln knew that God Almighty was the real great emancipator. Abraham Lincoln removed his folded speech from the pocket of his jacket along with his pair of eyeglasses. The look of the gaunt president putting on his reading glasses was reminiscent of General Washington, who, prior to delivering a speech to his troops after the American Revolution, had adorned a pair of spectacles and remarked to his troops, "Gentlemen, you must pardon me. I've grown gray in your service, and now find myself growing blind." In many ways, this president was the George Washington of his generation. Lincoln, like Washington, had become the indispensable man for his nation. President Abraham Lincoln stepped forward and took a deep breath. In that moment, the clouds parted for the first time that day, and golden rays of sunlight fell upon the east portico. The newly completed Capitol dome shone brightly in the fresh sunlight, reflecting a feeling of hope for the future. Lincoln let out a small chuckle, and under his breath he remarked, "Well now, I'm just superstitious enough to consider that a happy omen." He began his speech with a short summary of how the war had come upon the nation. He reminded his audience that the war had been unwanted by all, yet had come nonetheless. He declined to give any updates or details on the current situation in the war. He trusted that he had no news to give them that they had not already heard elsewhere. He then turned his attention to the core of his address. It would have been more fitting, though, to refer to this as a sermon, as midway through his speech he remarked, "Both North and South read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. But let us judge not, that we be not judged. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has his own purposes. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come. But woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which is in the providence of God must needs come, but which, having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war as the woe due to those by whom the offense came, shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet, if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." Upon completing his address, Lincoln took the oath of office and officially began his second term. The presidential sermon on the power of Providence would be one of his final public addresses, however. As Lincoln had addressed the thousands in attendance that day, behind him, and a little to his left, stood actor John Wilkes Booth. Abraham Lincoln's faith is a topic which has been the object of much debate over the past century and a half. Some will claim that he was an Orthodox Christian, while others have attempted to say that he rejected the Christian faith altogether. Now, I won't be trying to stake my claim in that debate here, and perhaps we will dedicate another episode to looking more closely at the nuances of his treatment of Orthodox Christianity. What we do see from today's story, though, is that at the very least, Abraham Lincoln had a very strong recognition of the power and the working of divine providence. He directly attributed the coming of the Civil War, the impending Union victory, and the ending of slavery itself to the actions of God. Lincoln's assessment was that Providence had seen fit to simultaneously bring judgment upon the nation for its reliance upon chattel slavery, while also bringing glory to his holy name by bringing about an end to the institution of slavery. He did not pull this conclusion from thin air, but relied heavily upon the Bible to come to this realization. In this speech, which only lasted about 7 minutes, he either quoted or alluded to biblical passages at least 6 times. He referenced God 14 times and mentioned prayer 3 times. These are significant numbers in such a relatively short amount of time. He spent roughly half of his address laying out a theological framework for where they had been, where God had brought them, and how they needed to move forward as a nation. In his first inaugural address in 1861, he had indeed been more Lincoln the lawyer. But in many ways, in his second inaugural address of 1865, he had become Lincoln the theologian. In spite of the grief which had stricken the nation and even his own household, Lincoln recognized that all things were in the power of the Almighty. He could have taken the opportunity to brag, to rub salt in the wounds of the Confederacy, to taunt his enemies or try to bring glory to himself. But instead, he chose to be humble. He chose to say, you know what? This war has been rough on us all. And God's hand has been evident in every single part of it. In times both good and bad, He's been actively working through it all. While we tore ourselves to pieces and received our due punishments, God did something only He can do. He freed an entire people. He took the ugliness of this horrible war and brought glory to His name through the ending of this ugly institution of slavery. Now let's go forward in love, in peace, in decency. Let's set aside our hatred and take care of one another, as God intended. In many ways, his public statements related to faith were also much like George Washington's, which we have observed in some of our earlier other episodes. But this speech was perhaps even more laden with scriptural references than what was typical of Washington's public addresses. Lincoln's second inaugural address reminds us of a golden thread which has existed throughout America's history. This golden thread that I refer to is a reliance upon divine providence, which has characterized major elements of the United States all throughout its history. As we've seen in earlier episodes, whether at the establishment of settlements like Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay, throughout the American Revolution, or in the wake of the Civil War, and on, key figures in the United States pointed to the work of divine providence and encouraged others to do so as well. Now, skeptics of this will attempt to say, of course, that Christian faith and a reliance upon God were not really that important in the grand scheme of things, that all of these examples are just overblown or misinterpreted. But I venture to say that Abraham Lincoln certainly would have disagreed with that skepticism. May we join with Lincoln in the belief that God works all things according to His sovereign will. His plans cannot be thwarted by war, by human sinfulness, or by anything for that matter. Nothing catches him by surprise, and nothing can overcome or overpower his purposes. May we recognize that all of human history, past, present, and future, fits within his hands. May we trust him to work out all things for his glory and for the good of those who love him. And may we, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, and with malice toward none and charity for all, love one another as Christ first loved us, even while we were yet sinners. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.